Over his 30 plus years of games, Sonic has had a lot of friends. Even in the concept phase for his first game, Sonic was supposed to be in a band with a chicken and Vector. But following the success that was the first Sonic game, Sega decided they needed to expand the cast, and with every subsequent release, at least one new character would be introduced to the series. Just like Sonic, these characters would have their ups, their downs, and ultimately their stagnation. So we're gonna go over how and when that started to happen again, but with other characters that aren't Sonic now. First, we must introduce who we'll be talking about in this video. The first aid in Sonic's plot to stop the rotund Dr. Eggman would have to be Miles per Hour. First appearing in Sonic the Hedgehog 2 in 1992, Tails has been following Sonic for the past 30 years. Despite the overall lack of story and dialogue, you can see that in the ending, Tails can make quick decisions on his own when he chooses to save Sonic, who's falling out of space after blowing up the Death Egg, by hopping in Sonic's plane and flying up to catch him. Overall, Sonic and Tails have an older little brother dynamic, where Tails will try and copy some things that Sonic does, and Sonic is more protective over him. Sometime between Sonic 1 and Sonic 3, we're not sure if this takes place before or after Sonic 2, Sonic went to go visit the little planet, which only comes into orbit every so often. Now, while I'm not going to recap the entire plot of Sonic CD because I really don't feel like doing that, there is one important thing to note, and that is, how exactly did Amy end up on Little Planet? More importantly, who is Amy Rose? Well, her creators wanted her to be the Minnie Mouse to Sonic's Mickey, but with a twist, that being that Sonic didn't reciprocate said feelings. Unfortunately, other than that, Amy didn't have a real clear personality, playing the role of a damsel in distress in her first title. She also might be psychic, or at least partially clairvoyant, due to her uses of the tarot card, which is what led her to being on Little Planet in the first place. In the manual for Sonic CD, it says that Amy followed her tarot cards to meet her true love on Little Planet. Sonic CD would be Amy's last mainline appearance for some time until 1998, which we'll talk about later. But she did appear in most spin-off games like Sonic R, Sonic the Fighters, Sonic Drift, etc., etc. He who does not chuckle, also known as Knuckles the Echidna, was introduced in the third, technically fourth, entry in the Sonic series. In this game, Knuckles is tricked by Dr. Eggman into working for him. He is ultimately betrayed by the rotten Robotnik at the end of the game. Knuckles, growing up all alone on Angel Island, is very gullible, but also not very trusting. Which doesn't really make sense, because how are you not trusting and gullible? But that's besides the point. These three characters would accompany Sonic in many of his adventures going forward, and would become the mainstay characters throughout the series. This video serves to show their ups and downs in character growth, and the inevitable fall from grace that they will suffer. In the early games after 1994, Tails and Knuckles were pretty defined characters. They had their own roles to play in the story. But Amy was more versatile. She was more of an experimental character. It felt more like Sonic Team didn't really know what to do with her. Like in Sonic R, she's one of two characters to use a vehicle. And in Sonic the Fighters, literally has a move that makes random objects fall from the sky and land on your opponent. Amy would also gain another thing from Sonic the Fighters, which is arguably her most iconic trait, that being her Pico Pico hammer. Now, we're still at the point where the Sonic series doesn't really have much of an overarching story, but that would soon change on December 23rd, 1998. Sonic Adventure was the first Sonic game to truly have a compelling story, one that made you actually want to play more of it for the story and not for the gameplay. It's not to say that the gameplay was bad, quite the opposite in fact. But we aren't talking about gameplay today, we're talking about characters, so let's get into it. Starting with Tails, he largely follows Sonic throughout most of the story, with the exception of his ending where he splits from Sonic and stops a terrorist attack on a major city via Eggman. Tails' arc in this game is all about learning to be dependent on himself and not needing Sonic for every little thing, because Sonic's not always going to be around to help you. This is an excellent example of showing growth without changing a character. because Tails learns and grows from this experience, but doesn't change who he is fundamentally. Moving on to Knuckles. Knuckles is the character who got the second most expansion in this game, mostly because the plot of the game revolves largely around his heritage. Knuckles has to travel the world after the Master Emerald literally explodes and the ancient primordial being Chaos emerges. So Knuckles has to go gather the shards and restore his prized possession. It also solves the dilemma that Knuckles apparently has at the beginning of the game. So in his introductory cutscene, he contemplates his life and how lonely it is being the last survivor of the Echidna clan and the sole protector of the Master Emerald. His worldwide exploration leads to him butting heads with Sonic and Tails a couple times, until eventually helping out near the end. Now if you remember earlier, I said Knuckles had the second most character expansion in this game. Who was the first, you might ask? Well, that would have to be former damsel in distress, Amy Rose. Amy has a whole revamp in Sonic Adventure 1. From her look, some aspects of her personality, Amy has been revamped to a foundation that can later be built upon to make a great character. In Sonic Adventure, Amy's depicted as a compassionate girl who helps a bird find its family, which sounds kind of boring, but it is pretty boring actually. Still, she keeps her unwavering love for our blue hero, as well as some of that impulsiveness that we saw earlier in her character. In Sonic Adventure, Amy truly went from just the girl to her own defined character. Now that we've seen what each character can do on their own, what would happen if all of these characters were together stopping one evil? The story of Sonic Adventure 2 is just that. In Sonic Adventure 2, we see the results of the previous game's character arcs, with Knuckles being more free to explore the world and Tails being an anti-establishment domestic terrorist. Unlike in the first game where Tails was largely following along with what Sonic did, Tails is here to bail Sonic out of most of the problems he causes himself. Sonic gets arrested by the US government. Tails flies his plane, destroys millions of dollars worth of government property on a max security prison to help his friend get out of jail. Tails isn't the only one guilty of committing treason, as Amy is the one who actually let Sonic out in the first place. For the earlier parts of the story, Knuckles pretty much does his own thing, exploring the world and trying to rebuild the Master Emerald again after he had to break it while keeping it away from Eggman and Rouge. By the time they get to Egypt, or whatever Egypt stand-in there is in the Sonic world, Knuckles is fully on board with Team Sonic and their treasonous plans of stopping Eggman. Amy not being playable in Sonic Adventure 2's main story does take a small hit to her characterization, as she doesn't get to go as in-depth as she did in the previous game. The most important thing Amy does is towards the end of the story, where she inspires Shadow to help stop the Eclipse Cannon from blowing up the Earth. Unfortunately, Sonic Adventure 2 would be the last time for a long time that these characters would actually be characters, because starting with Sonic Heroes, we would see a shift in their characterization. Starting with Sonic Heroes, pretty much every character in this game has been mischaracterized due to the fact that there's 12 characters all needing to fill a very simple story. The story had to be simple because Sega anticipated that this would be many people's first Sonic game, knowing that it would be their first multi-platform release. The problem lies in the fact that the characterization would never really pick back up. Knuckles and Tails are just fine in Sonic Heroes, but Sonic Heroes would also start one of the biggest problems of characterization in the entire series, and that being Amy's stalkerish, obsessive nature. Sonic Heroes is also the first game that we can consider to be part of the early modern internet era, meaning that a lot of fans started making Sonic content around this time on the internet. Games like Shadow the Hedgehog, which depict pretty much everybody as an annoying nuisance, perpetuated the characterization of the side characters in the Sonic series in the minds of fans. Characterizations would only get worse in Sonic 06, which, although had potential, was ruined by poor writing, poor time management, poor everything on Sega's part, honestly. Following Sega's poor management of this game, they took the critics' reviews in the wrong way. The oversaturation of characters in Sonic Heroes, as well as the poor character management in Sonic 06, led Sega to believe that Sonic doesn't need friends and is good on his own. Tails, Knuckles, and Amy would be relegated to minor background appearances. Actually, not really Tails. Tails is in pretty much every game, but he's a lot less of a character than he was before. Take Sonic Unleashed, for example. The whole plot of Sonic Unleashed is Sonic traveling the world to restore the continents after Eggman released a primordial god out of the core of the earth. I think Knuckles have something to say about this, right? You know, he has experience with primordial gods being released around him, but Knuckles isn't even in Sonic Unleashed. Most of the games that we're going to cover in this next section have little to no story. We're just going to rapid fire go through them and do little bullet points of how each character behaves in these games. Tails literally just gives exposition. Knuckles and Amy have one line each. Not a mainline game, but Knuckles appears to have lost a chromosome. Knuckles and Amy are in one cutscene. Tails whines like a little kid the entire game. Knuckles and Amy pretend to be military generals while Tails retreads his arc from Adventure 1, but worse. So after the 5-year gap between 2017 and 2022, the Sonic team decided to have decent writing for once. Fortunately, the point that I literally just said 2 seconds ago still stands. The Sonic Frontiers is definitely a more Sonic-centric story. Even within the Final Horizon update where you get to play as Knuckles, Tails, and Amy, the story is still very centered around Sonic, as Knuckles, Tails, and Amy, their main priorities are to do things that will help when you play as Sonic. Back to the main game, each island sees you helping out one of Sonic's friends with their internal struggles and battles. And while it's meant to show Sonic uplifting his friends, it really just feels like Ian Flynn and the writers being like, hey, remember when we did that? That was a thing that we did. Also, the writers noticed the negative reception towards Amy's portrayal in the 2000s, and instead of toning it back, they did an entirely 180. Amy is put back to being just a girl. Frontiers is a step in the right direction for the writing of the series, but can definitely be expanded upon in the future.
Bye!